Well, I think most of us are here, and so I'll keep an eye out for folks to let in, but let me mute you all, and then we'll have a word of prayer. Let's pray together. God, we thank you for the gift of your scriptures. We thank you for this confusing, challenging, beautiful, inspiring collection of stories that show us what life with you has been like over time. And we ask, as we look at what that relationship looked like over time, that you would be with us as we seek to have that relationship with you in our own time. And so bless us in this hour as we listen and talk and reflect, and may we learn something that draws us closer to you. We pray this in your Son's name. Amen. All right, now pardon me because I have to cough. There we go. So some of the beginning is always the same, and those of you who've been with me for a long time now, and in the other studies that we've done, you know that part of my own teaching philosophy or style is that you dig the groove deeply of the preliminaries of the things that that we all ought to know in order to move ahead into whatever we're talking about on a given night. So for those of you who have great memories and think this beginning part is repetitive, I apologize. That's exactly how I would respond. But we're exploring the history of the Bible and the history of how the Bible came about, and also trying to get a little bit of understanding of each book of the Bible as we move through the books. And we're doing it to deepen our understanding of how the Bible came to us, but also to deepen our understanding of what the Bible's saying to us today. I should say, and I should add into this intro, I believe that it is the task and privilege of every Christian to wrestle with the words of the Bible and see what God is trying to reveal about Father, Son, and Holy Spirit as you read those pages. What's God trying to show you? And because what God is trying to show you has a natural response, and that is what God is calling you to do and to be. And so I'm not one for memorizing my top 10 favorite Bible verses isolated from context so that I can recite them at any moment, even though that's exactly how I was raised in the church. I like looking at these individual books of the Bible and seeing what they show us about the relationship God had with people in a particular time and place, and what that teaches me about the relationship that God wants to have with me and with each of you in this particular place and time. And so I think that's a big part of what it means to be a Christian on the cognitive, reflective, prayerful, spiritual side. But I think it's meant to drive us in the service and risk and advocacy and all of the other things we're meant to do in the culture to demonstrate our love for neighbor, right? Not just our love for neighbor, which is how Jesus puts it, quoting Leviticus, but how God calls Abraham to that first covenant where he says, I will bless you and you will be a blessing to the nations. That's the agreement we're all in with God. God is blessing us. God has blessed us, even when we don't feel it. And the call from God on us, however imperfectly, is that we extend that blessing to other people. That there is the essence of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And we find the foundation for that relationship and that call in the words of the scriptures. And so for us, diving in to deepen our understanding of the Bible and how God speaks to us in it is an important part of what it means for all of us to be Christians. So because it's because baseball's playing in the other room, I'm going to give you the back of the baseball card for the Bible, which is that the Bible is made up of 66 books, 39 in the Old and 27 in the New. The Old Testament is written primarily in Hebrew and comes from a Hebraic cultural mindset, which is a different mindset than later on with the Greeks. But that even in that transition, there's a very significant version of the Old Testament that's written in Greek. And it's important to us in the 21st century because it would have been the Bible that Jesus read, or certainly that the people around Jesus were reading during his time. And so it's a very important part of our own understanding of the Old Testament, and it's in Greek. New Testament's in Greek, and I didn't touch on this in the last couple of weeks because I think I've hammered it pretty hard over the last couple of years with y'all, but when Alexander the Great conquered the known Western world, he imposed one language on it. For him, that was an extension of power. For him, it was an extension of his control and his coercive sovereignty over all of the known Western world at the time. What it gave us, though, was a huge region of the world that was connected by language, if not by culture. And so at the time of Christ, 2 or 3 centuries after the time of Alexander, and for those next few centuries, the known Western world was all unified by a common language. And that allowed for the spread and the communication and the development of theology in the early years of the church. For those of you who are with me in the creeds class, those early creeds, those are possible because everywhere from Asia Minor to the far end of North Africa and all the way up into Europe, into Central Europe, certainly by up to the top of Italy and I would imagine parts of Spain at that point, they all spoke the same language. Every place that had been part of the Roman Empire spoke part of not just Latin. Latin came later. They all spoke Greek. And so that's an important part of the story, not just of the development of the faith, but the development of the Bible. And so we're still in the Old Testament. We're in what we'll refer to as the Hebrew Bible, even though parts of it aren't in Hebrew. And we'll just remind ourselves that the key to reading the Bible as it was intended is understanding the historical situation that the Bible was written in. And I think we've been seeing, and we'll see again tonight, how important exile was to the development of these first books of the Old Testament. And so we've spent some time in the Torah. We're going to continue that. It's important to know the historical context for the writing of the Bible, and it's important to pay attention to what kind of writing we're reading when we read the Bible. And for those of you, I don't see anybody here who probably missed the newspaper analogy, so I won't do the whole thing again, but we are all conditioned to know just by picking up a newspaper what kind of writing we read to get certain kinds of information. And I want for us to have that same instinctive response to the different kinds of writing in the Bible. By the end of this class, we'll at least have a smattering of understanding of the different kinds of writing in the Bible and what we go to those pages for and what we don't. So we've been in the Torah. That was the first 5 books of the Bible. It has multiple names. For Hebrew people, it's the Torah, because that's their name for that. For later Greek people, they would call it the Pentateuch. It's the first 5 books of the Bible. We also know it as the Law. This is the origin of the Jewish, the construction of the relationship between Israelites and God is built on a system of rules. And within those rules, God acknowledges that no one can really live up to all those rules. And so there's a corresponding system of sacrifices that allowed humans in their relationship with God to make themselves right before God when they couldn't measure up to one or more or all of the laws. And so that's the relationship that God has with people in the Old Testament. It's built on this system of rules that were meant to draw people into a loving, faithful relationship with God. We need to hear law not as we would think of a simple set of rules now, but the rules then were relational rules. You will have no God before me. Honor your father and mother. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal. Do not murder. These are all relational rules. They were all meant to keep people clean in their relationship with God and also healthy in their relationships with each other. We see that not erased in the New Testament, but fulfilled in a new way in the New Testament. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So we've talked about the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, that has the primeval history, creation, fall, flood, and the Tower of Babel. The patriarchal history, all of the patriarchs that came through, that became the ancestral fathers of the Jewish faith, and ultimately the ancestral fathers and mothers of our faith. These are the characters that were there at the beginning, whose lives the rest of the faith was built on, and whose descendants became the people of Israel. At the end of the patriarchal history, the Israelites find themselves in Egypt, and then in the beginning of Exodus, they find themselves growing so quickly that the Pharaoh turned on them and made them slaves. And that enters Moses as this great character that we see in Exodus. But that's enough. I'm going to say this maybe 6 or 7 times tonight. Remember that the book of Exodus, the book of the Exodus, was written during exile. Looking back to the ways that God raised up a hero to bring people out of bondage in slavery in Egypt was exactly what the Israelites 500 years later or so were longing for as they languished in exile in Babylon. So there's understanding the historical context, not just of the story, but of when it was written or put down on a scroll. That's important for us understanding. Looking back during exile, that deliverance in the Old Testament, in the Exodus story, became the central story of Judaism from that time on. And so while they're out wandering, before they get to the Holy Land, the Promised Land, Leviticus shows us the worship practices for how people can maintain their cleanliness, their spiritual cleanliness before God. This is where you see all the rules and also all the different sacrifices that you have to do in order to cleanse yourself when you inevitably break those rules. As they're wandering, but before they're about to enter into the land of promise, God asks the Israelites to count themselves, to have a census, to determine what kind of an army they could raise to enter into the promised land. And that's the main story going on in the book of Numbers. And then the 5th book is Deuteronomy. This is the second law. It's the reorienting of the original law for new circumstances. For the people in the story, it's release from slavery. For the people writing and editing it, it is people who are about to be released from exile. Just cannot harp on that enough or too much. Anyway, we'll see if it's too much by the end. But once the people reach the land of promise, then they have to make the case for settling there and taking over from some of the people who already lived there. And that's where we were last week, looking at one of the more troubling books of the whole Bible, the book of Joshua. Joshua records the story of how the Israelites, with God's help and approval, apparently slaughter people left and right in order to take over their towns in order to take over their promised land. From any modern moral perspective, those stories are horrible to us. And so it's good for us we're going to see that quote again from Pete Enns about how the ancient people talked about God. But it's good to say here again how important it is to read the Bible first in the way it was written and intended to be read, for what the stories in it were trying to teach us and show us. It's good for us also to read the Bible for its encouragement and challenge now. But we stay in the lanes that the Bible grooves out for us when we first recognize what it meant then. So that our practice of interpreting the Bible should always be, what did it mean then, so that we can determine what it means now. How we react to Joshua and the other histories and the other violent events in the Old Testament is rooted in what we think the Bible is and how we think the Bible works, how we're supposed to use it in our own reflection and our own life and times. And I think I used these questions last week. Is the Bible a rule book? Is it an organized book of theology? I think we know that those two answers aren't really those aren't satisfactory claims for the Bible. None of those really work. It's also not accurate in our modern sense, because our modern sense of accuracy didn't exist when the books of the Bible were written. I told that wacky story about footnotes last week, right? That footnotes are relatively recent. The whole idea that you had to actually prove that what you were saying was accurate in some scientific way, that is relatively recent, maybe 200-300 years. And so we need to remember that those things are more recent ways of thinking that we can't superimpose back on the Bible. And yet we know, you probably know, that there are people within the Christian family who have been taught that the Bible is inerrant, that the Bible is without any kind of error, and that if you can prove an error in the Bible, that the whole thing collapses. I'm pretty sure that's not the case. And so I think that if it says that, I think the example I used last week is if Abraham had 100,000 camels, but if we somehow proved scientifically that he had 900 or 90,000 camels, somehow for some people that would be a diminishing of the Bible's accuracy and authority. And I want to say that we need to be able to read back like ancients did and say, they didn't have calculators. The paper wasn't cheap. Most people didn't write. If somebody said Abraham had 100,000 camels, what it probably meant was, that guy Abraham's got more camels than I've ever seen in my life. We have to be able to put ourselves back and think that way. Or we get caught up then. The alternative is to get caught up in details and think that somehow the Bible isn't true or accurate or worthwhile because it's not accurate in a way that it never intended to be accurate. Just nod if that makes some semblance of sense. So how we react to Joshua and the other histories is rooted in what we think the Bible is and how we think we're supposed to read it. And so, but I want to affirm that the Bible is our central document as Christians. As people of faith, we are called, among other religions, people of the book. It is in the stories and in the accounts and in the teachings of the Bible that we are meant to be unified and encouraged and called into service. And so the Bible is our central document, but it's important to understand that that central document is the story of humans' relationship with God told from the human point of view. that's where Pete Enns, I think, helps us quite a bit. One of the historical points that he makes in his book, The Bible Tells Me So, is that in the ancient world, uh, tribal cultures competed to see whose God was more tough and powerful. And one thing we learned from him is to let the Bible have its ancient voice, to speak first in its ancient voice before we try and glean from it what God might be saying to us now. Because only when we allow the ancient voice to be heard can we understand what all of that stuff, including those stories of slaughter, are meant to mean. When we listen to the ancient voice of the Old Testament, which really means listening to what it meant then, we learn a few things. And first, and this is something that I did not know, except through this book by Pete Enns and then others that he drew on for that book, is that ancient tribes tended to attribute their blessings to the ways that they were good before their own God. And they also tended to attribute their problems and their struggles and their calamities, disasters, to being disobedient. They had a very simple relationship with their God, both the Israelites and the surrounding tribes. When things were going well, they said, this is because we were good. And when things didn't go well, they said, we must have committed some sin and we have to repent. They didn't know that there was a third possible factor, which is just, accident or climate or other things that might happen that weren't necessarily part of their relationship with God. But that's the way ancient people talked about their relationship with God, and the Israelites are no different. Second, ancients used to talk about grand heroic battles where they wiped out all of their enemies. And I said last week, and it's still the analogy that works for me, it's like a kid on a playground saying that his dad could beat up someone else's dad. It was the way you got together, even into the Anglo-Saxon period, 1,500 years later in England. They were still singing stories about how they had vanquished their enemies. There's always a songwriter in the army. Maybe not now, but back then. And their job was to say, we had this little skirmish over here. Let's make it sound like we just invaded Northern Europe. And so a lot of the stories are told in this ancient voice where the skirmishes and the battles that they had along the way got portrayed as these grand heroic struggles where God intervened on their behalf, unless they lost, in which case they would say, we were not faithful, and so God removed himself from us and allowed us to be defeated. We're going to see a story like that later on this evening. Many of the stories are inflated from real stories, and some are like the myth stories, the primeval history of the first few chapters of Genesis. They explain something in their present time through a story of the past. So here's the point. The historical accuracy of the Old Testament isn't that every detail happened exactly as we see it on the page. The historical accuracy of the Old Testament is that it showed exactly how ancient people talked about their gods, and how the Israelites talked about God, about Yahweh, that is an accurate reflection of the way Israelites and other ancient tribes talked about their God. So we're slow on time, so I'm not going to go back into the Enns quote from last week. But I'll say that what we learn in the stories of Joshua and Judges tonight isn't that it's okay to slaughter all your enemies and then attribute all that slaughter to God. What we learn, though, is that it's our job to talk about God in a way that makes sense in our own culture. It is our job to talk about God and to tell the story of Jesus in a way that makes sense in our own culture so that they can believe. It's our job to talk about God in a way that makes sense to our neighbors so that they can believe it too. That's one way we live up to our end of the covenant. And so in the end, I think we take away a couple of important things about how to read these difficult texts. The first is always reading them in context. But the second is that when we interpret the Bible now on this side, in the 21st century, when we interpret any part of the Bible, we do it through the lens and the filter of the story of Jesus. That is just so important. It is the incarnation and the ministry and the death and resurrection. That is the central story and the central filter for understanding everything that happens in the Bible, even the stories that don't make sense to us, even the stories that offend us, even the stories that we struggle with. And that brings us finally to our story for tonight. It's the book of Judges, the next book in the Bible. And so before we get going, it's good to have a big picture view of what's happening. A lot of the stories, a lot of the development of Israelite culture in the Bible as we see it is built on the idea of governance, how they're governed. Let me give you an example. In the garden, Adam and Eve, and I get that these are the primeval stories, right? These are the stories that are meant to explain how we ended up in a relationship with God. In the garden, Adam and Eve move freely and without separation from the presence of God in the garden. If you read those stories again, and some of them are foreign to some people because they never go back and read those stories because we spend most of our time in the New Testament. Some of them are so familiar from Sunday school and years of maybe being in or teaching Sunday school that they're so familiar that they've lost some of their meaning. But in those stories, God is walking through the garden amidst the people. Just one story starts with this line, and so God, Yahweh, was walking through the garden in the cool of the day. It's just, there's an intimacy to the way that things ran there. Adam and Eve were good, and God maintained this immediate presence with them. Then sin happens. And then there's all this all of a sudden, they notice they're naked, so they got to put clothes on. They got the pain in childbirth, and they have to work for their food instead. All of this is part of the ways that Israelites explained the beginnings of their relationship with God. So as you move through Genesis, then it's not just God interacting in an immediate personal way. The patriarchs, each one of them becomes like the godfather of the entire extended family and growing nation. And that happens for generations and generations, as you hear later on in the Old Testament, where they say, you're the people of Abraham, Isaac, and Joseph, or Abraham, Isaac, Joseph, and Israel. And so all of these people end up being the ways that the Israelites are governed. And then you get Moses. Moses ends up being the first true heroic leader of God's people. You remember the quote from the historian that I read the last couple of weeks. Moses was beyond the power of the human mind to invent. Moses has to have some rooting in actual history because according to the people who've read everything that exists from that Bronze Age period, Moses stands out as a character that is so amazing that he was beyond the power of the human mind to invent. Moses runs everything, and then Moses dies and hands it to the next leader, who's Joshua. And Joshua is the military leader and heir to Moses. But after Joshua, the people, the Israelites, are growing. they're growing into 12 tribes of different sizes and different power and levels of power and wealth. But it was going to take more than one person to make all of the decisions. And so that's where the judges come in. The judges end up being divinely inspired leaders who are the arbiters. They adjudicate. They are the judges, literally. They are the people come with a conflict or with a plan, and it's the judges who tell them yes or no, or you're right and you're wrong. And so the judges end up running things in more regional ways. I want to show you just a map of what I'm talking about here. This is what the people of Israel looked like at the time. Are you seeing that yet? I'm not sure why that didn't work. Let me just try and open this again. This is the 12 tribes of Israel. And, oh, here we go. I was missing one. So this is what it looked like. And for those of you who know your geography now, the modern political state of Israel, it goes from about up here down along this river west over to the Mediterranean Sea, and down into this area which is the Sinai Desert down here. And so this was it's a small country now with the internet and phones and air travel, but this was a pretty large area to govern for one person. And so there were judges in the different areas. And the book of Judges tells the story of 6 different judges. And we'll talk about one of them at the end, because one of the 6, 1/6 of the judges who ran the Israelite culture during this period was a woman. And not a woman who was powerful because she was married to a powerful guy. Matter of fact, they only mention her husband once, except for as a part of her name. And so Deborah was powerful because of Deborah. And we're going to hear a little bit of her story in a few minutes. But the judges are these divinely inspired leaders who solve grievances and lead the people. The judges spoke for God, and they helped this tribal nation survive. In the book of Judges, we see a cycle of people obeying and being blessed, or disobeying and being punished. Obeying and being blessed, disobeying and being punished. The teachings of the book of Judges and the stories of the individual judges and their experiences, they move through that cycle, being good and being blessed, being bad and being punished. Let's just have your every 5-minute reminder here. This is written by God's people in exile because they were bad and were being punished. And so it's crucial for them to tell this story, to try and remind the next generation and the generation after that, that it matters that they have this relationship with God, and it matters that they hold up their end of the covenant. Otherwise, they'll get punished again. So the focus on being faithful to God and being blessed, as opposed to being unfaithful and being punished, is a narrative that made sense to people who were in exile because they were being punished. And so I want to look at just a few excerpts from the 2nd chapter of Judges to see what's happening in this book. And I'm going to put the slides up, but I am going to read them. You can read them along with me. And because I think these are so, this is pretty important for us to see. Judges 2:10-15. After that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, which means after the group that had come into the promised land from wandering in the wilderness, after that group had died, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. In other words, the whole story of Israel is about their relationship with God. And it took literally one generation for them to forget that. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Notice that Lord is all capital letters. That's Yahweh. They did evil in the eyes of Yahweh, and they served the Baals. And the Baals are the local gods, the regional gods that were there when they got there. They forsook Yahweh, the God of their ancestors who had brought them out of Egypt. That's a whole name for God right there. The Lord, the God of their ancestors who had brought them out of Egypt. Even here, they're telling the story. They're reminding them of the story of their relationship with God and how he has rescued them. They followed and they worshiped various gods of the people around them. They aroused Yahweh's anger because they forsook him and served Baal and the Ashtoreths, other gods. In his anger against Israel, Yahweh gave them into the hands of raiders who plundered them. He sold them into the hands of their enemies all around, whom they were no longer able to resist. Whenever Israel went out to fight, the hand of Yahweh was against them to defeat them, just as he had sworn to them, and they were in great distress. Hear the cycle, hear it in there, that when you obey your God, you're blessed, but when you disobey, you're punished. And for the ways that ancient tribes, and especially the Israelites, talked about how they won battles. They won battles because Yahweh went before them in battle and defeated the enemy for them. But notice here, they've been disobedient. And so what does God do? In his anger, Yahweh gave them into the hands of raiders who plundered them. Whenever Israel went out to fight, the hand of Yahweh was against them to defeat them, just as he had sworn to them. Now, whether that's actually what happened from God's point of view, we don't know. But we know that their interpretation of the event of losing a battle was a way for them to look inward and say, we must have disobeyed. And of course, we know from the first part of this paragraph that one generation into being in the promised land, they forgot whose they were. They forgot whose promise put them in that land in the first place. And so this chapter continues. Then Yahweh raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of these raiders. Yet they would not listen to their judges, but prostituted themselves to other gods and worshipped them. They quickly turned from the ways of their ancestors who had been obedient to Yahweh's commands. Whenever Yahweh raised up a judge for them, he was with the judge and saved them out of the hands of their enemies as long as the judge lived. For Yahweh relented because of their groaning under those who oppressed and afflicted them. But when the judge died, the people returned to ways even more corrupt than those of their ancestors, following other gods and serving and worshiping them. They refused to give up their evil practices and stubborn ways. It is a cycle of being faithful and being blessed, and being unfaithful and being punished. But the judges were divinely inspired and chosen, raised up by God to lead them and remind them of their relationship with God, and also to govern them. And so then we get to this last part. Therefore, the Lord Yahweh was very angry with Israel and said, because this nation has violated the covenant I ordained for their ancestors and has not listened to me, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations Joshua left when he died. I will use them, these other nations, to test Israel, to see whether they will keep the way of Yahweh and walk in it as their ancestors did. So some of this is history. These things happened, right? The wandering Israelites did settle in Canaan, and they did have to fight to be there. They were attacked from surrounding countries, and they had to defend themselves. And probably some of their battles were battles of aggression, of taking territory. But remember that this is written by people in exile. And so they understand this idea of Yahweh being angry with Israel because they violated the covenant about being faithful to God and accepting God's blessing and sharing that blessing with other people. And so God isn't going to defend them anymore from the nations that were still to fight after Joshua died. And in their understanding of their own history, God used these other enemy nations to test Israel to see if they would come back to faith in Yahweh. Folks, that's the whole. There's some very cool stories in Joshua, but this is the story of Joshua. I mean, I'm sorry, of Judges. This is the story of that we see of Israel in the book of Judges. One thing for us to notice in Judges is how many women play prominent roles. Now, there are a handful of significant women in the story, including one of my personal heroes, a woman named Gail, not spelled the way you might know, Gael. And Gail enticed an enemy general with some sweet food and some a nice bottle of milk, and took him into his tent and drove a tent stake through his head. I'm just looking at the names here on my screen to see if I'm going to get in trouble for this, but there were some badass women in Judges, seriously. And I'm sure there's a technical term for that, but I don't know it. There are some amazing, heroic Israelites who happen to be women whose stories get told in the book of Judges. None of them are as amazing or exceed the amazingness of Deborah. And give me just a second, I got to pull a Bible now. In Judges 4, we meet truly one of the more amazing female characters. We've talked about Moses being a character that is so outrageous that no one would have invented him. Well, I wonder if we can't say the same thing about Deborah. Deborah's whole story is told, most of it is told in Judges 4. And then after it's told in narrative form, just in storytelling form in chapter 4, they make a song out of it in chapter 5. So you have chapter 4 that tells the story of Deborah, and then you've got this, you have Deborah's song, which takes up most or all of chapter 5 in Judges. All of it worth reading. But Deborah, after the death of one of the leaders, one of the other judges, Deborah, who was already a prophet, somebody who was a mouthpiece for God, the wife of a guy named Lapidoth, and you really just don't see much about the husband anymore after this. She was a leader of Israel at that time. She would sit under Deborah's palm tree. I'm pretty sure she sat under a palm tree that was named after her, not that she found a palm tree that already had her name on it. She sat under a palm tree near Ramah and Bethel, which are two towns that might be familiar to you from Bible reading, and people came to her and she would settle disputes. Men, women, old, young. Deborah was the one they went to settle all of their disputes. And as was true for Israel for a lot of this time, they were being attacked by enemies outside their borders. Deborah was faithful. She believed that if they served God faithfully, that God would go before them in battle and that they would be victorious in protecting all of their nation. The male general would not go into battle. He did not believe that God would protect them. And so Deborah said, I'll do it myself. You can come along for the ride, but don't dare say that you did this when we win. This battle is God's. Deborah gave credit to God, but Deborah was the human leader in that story. And that's where you see this other story of Jael. I spelled her name wrong. It's Jael, and she is the one who goes into the general's tent and kills him, and that's a part of the strategic plan that allowed Israel to win that battle. This is all done by a woman, and there are no questions. There is absolutely nothing in the text here that says, wow, it was a woman who did that. Or there's nobody on the fringes saying, well, I don't believe women ought to be in leadership. There's nobody in this story that sees Deborah as anything other than a divinely inspired leader sent by God to lead their people, not only in everyday justice, but in battle. And Deborah is truly an amazing character, and is one of the people who helped lead, at least for a generation or so, Israel back into a faithful covenant relationship with God. So I know I'm being repetitive. Just remember, all of these things are written in exile. They were stories that were told, but they were compiled in their present order and written with their present emphasis in exile. These were meant to tell people who had been disobedient and were being punished how not to do that again. That's why these first books of the Old Testament are compiled and written and edited in their present form. There's more coming, but that'll get us to the end of Judges. So I'm going to unmute you. Let's see. You can. It should be something on your screen that says unmute. There you go. Who's got a question or a comment? I love ending on Deborah. I just think she's so amazing. I would follow her into battle. But I'm glad I don't have to.
Yeah.
Yeah, Stephen, please.
Just a brief comment on the issue of soldiers writing songs about their victories. I think it was on 60 Minutes on Sunday. There was a piece on the Ukrainians coming back in their combat with the Russians, and there was a soldier. I think he was playing his guitar, and they showed him, and he was singing a song that he had written, and the soldiers were singing along with him about their recent victory.
Sure. Sure. If you've been in a Navy town, you know there are sea shanties that all tell the story of some long lost battle, complete with usually obscenities built into the story. All the great epic. I was an English major. All the great epic poems from the Beowulf. Within the story of Beowulf, you know, where Beowulf has to do battle with Grendel, and all of these things are going on. They spend most of their time in what's called the mead hall, which is really a bar. It's a big hall where all the soldiers got together to sing songs about their battles and get drunk. But every culture told the story of battles that way until the development of modern history, until we started saying, well, you know, yes, you won the battle, but it's a more complicated story than that, and we have the records to prove it. But nobody would have cared back then. They'd have laughed you out of the mead hall. You tried to say, well, Beowulf, that's not exactly how it happened. That's who else? Don't be bashful. Tad?
Well, I read a book on the history of China, and one of the things that shocked me when I read it was each emperor re-documented history.
Yeah.
I mean, China kept extraordinary records of their history. And I thought, boy, that's strange, until I realized we kind of do the same thing. That's kind of human nature to, redocument and make yourself look taller and better looking than you really are.
Okay, I'm going to scoot up now, trying to get my head up this.
I'm going to scoot back so you can't see my face as well.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And I think that for historians, we talk about the accepted story that we got, let me give you an example. In US history, the Civil War was fought for a bunch of reasons, but one of them was about slavery. In the years after the Civil War, there grew up a new generation of Southern historians who started saying, well, the war was really about states' rights. And so historians had to go back and correct that attempt at a revision by saying, and here's how they did it. Here's how a historian was able to refute the idea that the Civil War was fought by the South just for states' rights. He got every secession document from the states that seceded and formed the Confederacy, and they all said they were leaving to preserve slavery in their own handwriting. And so that's how, so you're right, everybody tries to write history that's self-serving, but modern history gives us tools, gives us an apparatus for making a claim and then showing why we make that claim. And so it was it was a dishonest claim for a generation. It was meant to whitewash, literally whitewash Southern guilt over slavery in the Civil War. So yes, that's happening. And I'm sure that's happening in the Bible. I'm sure that some of the accounts of these battles were written and compiled in exile to make poor Israel look bad because they were being punished. To make them look like the victim because God was mad at them. But it was also a way to teach a newer generation how not to get themselves in that situation again. Who else? Anybody else got a Deborah story? It's worth reading, chapters 4 and 5 of Judges. I mean, honestly, she's pay attention when you read it to the declarative things they say about Deborah. There's literally no mention of her femaleness being an issue in her leadership. They moved effortlessly from a man judge before her to a man judge after her, but she's the one that gets exalted more than most of them. Samson is one of the 6 judges. Samson's got a troubled story. You got to read to the end of the book to get to him. But Samson's got Delilah and the whole problem with his hair, and it's a complicated story. Deborah is probably, of the 6, the most. She is the most undiluted hero of all 6 judges. Yeah, Stephen.
Do they rise to power, or are they, how do they reach their positions? They're anointed by God, or?
I think they're anointed by God. That's a great question. I may have to look that one up. That's a really good question. My sense is that they emerge in the same way that prophets do. And remember that the prophets that we read which seem like they come way later because they're deeper into the Old Testament, they're contemporary with this time. For those of you who are with me in the Amos story, as we looked at the book of Amos, Amos would be after the storytelling, but 200 years before this was written. That makes sense?
Yeah.
Amos is a 7th century BC prophet. And this is a story, I don't know exactly when this story falls in the timeline, but it's not written until the 6th century BC. So Amos is 100 years older in his ministry than the writing of this story. So there's a lot of overlap, but my sense is that they would have emerged like the prophets, that they would have been somehow acknowledged through some miraculous blessing. There's no sense that it's a democracy. These are people chosen by God, divinely emplaced in their position as judges. You guys know the story about the civil service administration in the US? Because it always has a parallel to me, for me, with the story in Judges, that up until, I think it's Abraham Lincoln, but it might be a president after him. There used to be, after an election or after an inauguration, a line that went on for miles to the White House of people waiting to get government jobs. And sometimes they were waiting in line to go in and talk to the president and ask for a job. The Civil Service Administration was meant to organize that and to disperse all of that authority and responsibility and drudgery of hiring people for everything from postman to whatever. And so I always think that the judges kind of are, that's a model for that. Moses tried to run everything, but he got tired of it. He'd just sit there, and a couple of times Moses actually complains about having to adjudicate everybody's problems. Joshua has to do it, but Joshua's off fighting wars, so not a lot of it gets done during Joshua's time. It's after Joshua that God creates a different governance system where judges end up running the country and acting as the judicial system in the country to settle disputes between tribes. Some of these tribes, you know, they all go back to brothers, right? The 12 sons of Israel. But some of these tribes went to war against each other. Judges had to intervene sometimes in intertribal and intra-tribal wars. So they are that passed for modern governance at the time. Now, eventually, for those of you who know where this story's headed, people said, gosh, other countries have kings. We want to have kings. We want a king. And so, and the kings are a disaster for Israel, but we're going to get to that in a little bit. But that's what I mean, that so much of this story hangs on this developing, this evolution of governance. First, it's a face-to-face relationship with God. Then it's a leader. Then it's a judge. Then it's a king. Pretty soon it's Christ. But that, we haven't gotten that far yet. 8:02, any other questions or comments tonight? Anything else? I'm having fun. I hope you guys are having fun. And I promise eventually I'm gonna distill that review part, but the review part is the part that you all are gonna remember after this class is done. And I think that when I get up, or when a liturgist gets up to read a text on Sunday, you're gonna say that text was written in exile. That's why they're talking. Let me close this in prayer. God, thank you for the ways that you continue to relentlessly pursue us and have relationship with us. Whether it's the way that you interacted with people in the earliest days, to different kinds of government, to finally giving us your Son and your Holy Spirit. God, you have met us where we are with ways to maintain our relationship to you, and we're thankful for that. We ask that the things that we learn and the things that we reflect on in your scriptures would help that relationship grow. We pray this in your Son's name. Amen.
Again.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, John.
See you Sunday.
John. Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Night.
Good.
Good night.